So I'm going, to present some aspect of research interaction with plants, which is illustrated here by a very familiar scene of a tree moving in wind. And so I work at Ecole Polytechnique in Paris across the channel. So let's go forward. So first of all, the plant interaction with fluid is a very vast topic. So maybe I should give some general aspects first. Well, of course, there are fluid inside plants too. So I'm not going to consider this. This is a fascinating domain, of course. So I'll just talk about external fluids. Well, fluids can be air and water, sometimes both for the same plants, not at the same time, but in different part of the year, for instance, or it's flooding. And something I want to emphasize is the bottom line here, is that from a plant's point of view, there are two main stress called abiotic stress. That is not biological stress, mechanical stress here. One is gravity, of course, plants are facing gravity. And the second one is fluid loading. And they are typically of the same orders of magnitude of forces. So this is really something very important in the way a plant grows and lives its life. And so there are a lot of effects of fluid loading, of course, on plants. Some are negative, that you can imagine, but some also are positive. I just mentioned some of them as well. So this is a general framework I will be in. Let's go a bit further. So first of all, I should emphasize that the particular case of a tree swaying in the wind is just one specific case. If you think of the Langre scales in space, if you are interested in pollens, for instance, that's just about micron size. If you're interested into populations, like the way a forest set of trees, a canopy breaks down, for instance, this is a population where you're interested into kilometers. So there's a huge range of length scales. In terms of time scales, some things happen very quickly in plants, like photosynthesis, which are 10 to the minus 2 seconds scales. If you think of swaying, we are in the hertz, so in the second time scale. If you think of growth, this is for years sometimes, of course. If you think of evolution, people have worked also on the effect of wind on evolution, you'll have, of course, much larger time scale. So instead of having a systematic kind of review, I just want to pick out some very recent papers on the topic. So this is 2021 papers to illustrate what kind of people are interested in this topic and what the kind of things they are doing. So the first is from the main journal you're familiar with, or GFM. There was a paper recently on how to measure the drag force on the tree using measurement in the flow field. So that's not an easy task. It's a very interesting paper. Here is a completely different paper in a journal which is focused on biomimetics. Is to where they try, people in Switzerland, where they try to design a system that's going to harvest energy from the leaf fluttering itself by making an artificial leaf. And the third one here is related to the very important issue in photosynthesis, which is sunflex on the leaves of the plant. And what's called windflex is the way these sunflex, of course, move as the plant moves. And this has a very important influence on the way the photosynthesis and the thermal aspect of the plant is considered, which is again a different kind of journal and different kind of community. Just to illustrate more, this is not the first one is not a plant; it's a coral. It's about coral, but coral they behave in some aspect like plant, flexible corals, where the motion of the corals are actually related to the way they feed. Probably this is not the kind of journal you would be typically reading, the Journal of Integrative Agriculture. So there's a lot of things on the way in plant factory you would grow lettuces, and the way the air that you put inside is going to affect the motion of the lettuce and to affect its growth. So this is 2021 too. And here is a more classical topic, of course, that you can imagine, which is wind damage to forest, which has a huge, of course, economical consequences, and thus Journal of Forest Research to illustrate. So these are some aspects of where people are interested in developing and are developing models. I want also to cite some rather unusual cases that you would maybe not have imagined, or not even myself, was of people who are interested in quantitative prediction of motion of plants by external fluid, like wind, for instance. So people working on gestural communication in chimpanzees have noticed that the communication is strongly affected by the way the plant background of the apes is moving. And of course, for this, they need to know how plants are moving. Another topic, which is Wi-Fi. So Wi-Fi outside is affected by leaf motion. And this is quite important for outdoor Wi-Fi in public spaces. And the last one is the world of video games or film animation in general, but real time is quite important, is how do you represent correctly the consequence of flows, whether a wind or helicopter or something, on a plant. So for this, you need to have quantitative and rather accurate descriptions of the motion of the plant. So actually, is there anything specific in terms of flow-plant interactions? From a soil mechanics point of view, well, the plant here I just illustrated a tree and an antenna. The plant usually has a very large number of substructures and a variety of organs. Well, some engineering-made structures do have the same, sometimes not, often not so complex. Maybe the second point is quite important, is that the plant has grown on site. And so the way it is strongly influenced by what it has seen as it grew. Essentially, the geometry, the material, and the characteristics is really something site-dependent. Well, of course, the man-made structures are site-dependent. That's the way we design them, but they have not grown on site. That's quite different. And one of the very important difference is that in engineering design, we usually design stiff structures, whereas plants, for reasons that we shall talk later also, are often quite flexible, and that, of course, does make a different behavior. So maybe to be a bit more specific about what I'm going to talk about, so we have some fluid mechanics, we have some soil mechanics, and we have some biological aspects. So in the plant, so there is some fluid mechanics which I'm not going to talk about, but I'm going to consider the plant as a solid. And of course, the interaction between this soil mechanics and the plant biology is a topic of plant biomechanics, most of plant biomechanics. And what does a fluid do on this? It does have some direct effects, which I'm not going to talk about, which is, for instance, the effect of wind, or even the local air condition on the gaseous exchange at the leaf scale, for instance. This is a very classical problem in plant biology, which is directly related to the local fluid mechanics. I'm going to talk more about these aspects, which are the fluid mechanics and the solid mechanics, so the coupling between the two, which is actually it's mostly the fluid mechanics that's forcing the solid mechanics, and so how the plants are going to deform and move. And of course, this does have some influence on the biology of the plant. So, of course, the topics are immensely varied. So I'm just going to summarize a few of the topics we have been working on in the past 10 years or so. I'm just going to pick two general topics. One is drag reduction by flexibility, and the other is foliage motion, with some minor points I'm going to detail also. So there is a lot of work that has been done on what's the drag affecting a plant or plant organ when you have flow on it. This is important, for instance, just for the integrity of the leaf. And there is a seminal paper by Steve Vogel in the late 80s, where he did measure drag on a single leaf in rather high flow, so it's high Reynolds flow certainly. And he noticed that the increase of drag with velocity was not going to the U square law. Well, for some parts it was, and then it shifted to a different kind of power law, which was more like 1 to the U to the 1 or 1.5. And that appeared when the leaf started to deform strongly. So he called this reconfiguration. So there's been a lot of data produced by people working on plants and the drag on plants or part of plants. And here are just a few examples. on a single plant, a daffodil or a much more complex mountain grass. This is a full poplar that people have instrumented, and this is a water pansy, so in water. And for all these plants, how diverse they are, you can see that the drag law is something like due to the 1.2 to 1.5. Seems very, there's something common to all this, although the geometry are so different. So why do you have a change in the drag law? So the first idea, of course, you would have is to say that as a leaf, for instance, but the other one to deform, you reduce the cross-flow area, certainly. And also, there is some streamlining of the structure. So this is certainly also going to contribute to the reduction in some kind of drag coefficient somehow. There is another mechanism which I'm not going to detail at all, but that you can imagine is that something like a tree, for instance, so that's the case of many plants, are actually macroscopically some kind of a poroelastic system. And as they deform under wind, as the parts of them deform under wind, this poroelastic system somehow clamps in some parts. So this has of course, some influence on drag, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. First idea is to, of course, to do some model systems to see how this works, to try to understand. Of course, if you do an experiment with a rigid plate and another one of the same dimension, but a bit more flexible or very flexible, what you see, of course, is that drag is quite different. And that the rigid one, of course, has a U-square law. And the other ones have a completely different way of evolution. You also find out some not very predictable ideas or intuitive ideas, which shows that the fact that some large plates have a lesser drag than smaller plates, just because they bend more. So there's a kind of crossover between the large plate that have a large drag, and at some point become with less drag than the smaller ones. Where does this come from, and why does the drag reduce, and what do we change? So there is a simple explanation in terms of dimensional analysis, which is the following. If you think of a plate, a rigid plate, and the flow, well, you know that the scaling of drag is rho u square, W would be the width here, and L would be the cross-flow dimension I'm interested in. And of course, that's a u square scaling with velocity. Now, if you consider the same plate, but now really flexible, and you imagine there is a kind of limit state where the thing is going to be really bent. And in that case, the length L here is not going to be really relevant. If you change L, it's not going to change anything. And so you have to find some other length in the dimensional analysis, and the length has to be built with something which is depending rigidity, because otherwise you are missing a dimension. And this length is here. It has to include bending rigidity and velocity. And with that new length, you get a 4/3 velocity dependence. So just by losing one length scales and replacing it by one based on velocity, which appears naturally, you get a 4/3 exponent. So if you look at these model systems and others, there is a seminal paper by Alban and Shelley on a very small thread in a soap film. What you find out is that the reduction of drag versus drag if the plate was rigid, actually does, of course, decrease with the Cauchy number, which is the velocity squared scaled by the stiffness. And so you can somehow correlate some of the data points of many experiments. And the shape here of this is the 4/3 experiment, the 4/3 exponent, which is -1/3 in this kind of variables. So it seems that for these simple systems, there is some reasonable agreement with what we are talking about, and with the dimensional parameters involved. And if now we go back to plants, which are certainly not modern systems, geometrically, there has been some review where people have connected the exponents for a lot of plants, either in air or in water, with shapes as diverse as the one I'm showing you here. And what they found out is a kind of average of exponent, which doesn't really mean anything, but is just an order of magnitude of the mean exponent of drag, which is 1.2 and 1.4 for the two sets they've been working on. And this is really compatible with the 4/3 exponent I was giving with a very simple explanation. So what does that mean? This means that, of course, the geometries are differ, but all these things are made of plates and beams and shells, but all this deform in bending, essentially. So as soon as you deform in bending, you are going to have a 4/3 exponent. Now you can go a bit further to that. So that's elastic drag reduction, which is very important for a plant because, of course, it's reversible. As soon as the storm is finished, the plant gets back to its shape, or the leaf gets back to its shape. But there is also another way that plant reduce drag, which is called flow-induced pruning. Certainly, you have seen in forest after a storm that you have a lot of small branches around, and you can try to model this and see what comes out of it. So just consider a very simple tree. There are some generic models of this, and just put some flow on that and imagine a very simple local drag related to the geometry and the U square. So this is equivalent actually in terms of mechanical strength to a cone. And imagine that the system is rigid, so the computation of stress is pretty easy, but that is brittle, so it's going to break locally when some limit stress is reached. So in that case, we are going to have pruning, that is breaking some hair or at the base or in terms of a tree shape, losing some small branch or breaking at the trunk scale. And if you look at the condition that you have to have this instead of this, which is which is quite different, what you find out is that most tree geometries satisfy the condition for pruning instead of breaking. That is, are going to lose pieces before breaking, which is, of course, a not so reversible, but still better than losing your life when the issue is very large. Of course, the question is, what do plants do? Do they choose elastic reconfiguration, elastic drag reduction, or do they choose flow-induced pruning? Actually, they can choose both because we have shown that there is a compatibility between the two strategies. You can have a system that develops first a drag reduction by elastic deformations, such as the one we have here, which is a bit like a bush. But you first have a change in the law of drag, which is about the 4/3 here. And then at some points, you locally reach some stress, some limit stress, and then you break pieces. In that case, you are going to have actually a limit drag that you don't overcome. So this is very good because this means that you can protect the root of the system very easily. Actually, in the life of a plant, sometimes they are stiffer, sometimes they are softer. So you can also try to wonder what's going to happen if you have not only a steady flow, but an unsteady flow. The first steady flow you can think of is oscillating flow that you have, for instance, in water in the wave region close to the shore. So what you see here is not a plant, it's a soft coral, so gorgona. That's the issue is exactly the same. So if you do a very simple model of a beam with by an elastica and a simple model of interaction by resistive force and reactive force. So these are simple model of interactions, local ones, and you compute the stress in the dynamics. What you find out is that the inertial effects actually do change the reconfiguration scenario I was showing you, but they do not prevent from drag reduction. So flexibility also always reduces stress in oscillating flows, except in some very particular case of resonance. There is the same conclusion also if you consider not only the deformation, but what can be induced by the deformation, which is flutter. At some point, flutter is a full coupling between the local dynamics of the leaf here and the flow. And you can have this with the models I was previously presenting, kind of plate or beam flutter. And what you find out is that even though you have a very large range of regimes that appear, from stable ones to periodic ones to chaotic ones, actually, you do not prevent drag reduction. You do modify it, but there is no way that flutter is going to give you a larger drag than if the system was rigid originally. I should just mention the work of some other colleagues in Marseille and Paris and here. What's happening at low Reynolds number? So the picture is quite different at low Reynolds number, just because of course the law of drag is different, and the parameters affecting drags are quite different. And what you find out is that, for instance, if you sediment a flexible fiber, more or less flexible, what you find out is that and you deduce the drag out of this, as you increase the velocity, of course, the drag is a power 1 low. And at some point, if deformation becomes important, you have a small change of the exponent in a transient regime. And then you are back to 1 exponent where the system is completely deformed, but still you still have a U1 exponent. So it's a completely different picture, actually quite interesting. So you can imagine that plenty of things can be done out of these 4 plans. So, but let's try to do something else out of it. So I just want to mention some ideas of bioinspiration. The first one will be to the following kind of challenge. Can we have something which has a 0 exponent? Can we have a body deforming that have a drag that does not depend on velocity at some point? So if you take the same argument we had before with the bending stiffness, where we had u to the 4/3, and if you imagine actually a system that is not stiff by bending, by elasticity, but stiff because of tension, which is the case of a, say, a guitar chord or a flag in most cases, for instance, or membrane, what you find out is that the length scale that comes out of the same reasoning is actually 1/u² dimension, which means that you can expect a u to the power 0 dependence of the drag law, which is something quite counterintuitive. So you can do the experiments. Here's experiment on one of those systems. There are many systems that actually satisfy this condition. It's a ribbon, very low thickness, which is tension by weight. So the stiffness does come from tension that you put under flow, and you measure the drag here. And what you find out is that as you increase the flow velocity, of course, the drag first increased like u². This is a dimensionless drag. This is the flow velocity. And at some point, quite suddenly, at the critical velocity, the drag goes to a very, very low power. In the experiment, 0.1, and in the model, it goes to a plateau, because the system is actually what's called a fluid pulley, because the forces are here normal to the membrane. So this is a very odd system. There are a lot of systems of the same kind that have a 0 dependence with velocity in terms of drag. And actually, there's a question is, can you design a system that will have the drag law that you want? Not necessarily a power law, something, any kind of drag law you want. Can you put that into a geometry or into a material characteristic? So we have been working recently on things called origamis, which are foldable systems in flow, which have sometimes very odd drag law with velocity, or something called kirigamis, which are things with slits, and that can have a lot of weird deforming. And of course, the question is, can you do a reverse engineering problem and design the shape such that it has the drag law that you want for some purpose? So this was about drag. So it's, as you can imagine, a very wide topic. Plants have a lot of strategies. There are a lot of ideas around this, but this is static. So I want to illustrate something more now on the dynamics and more to foliage. So foliage motion is something quite important where you want to have quantitative models, as I was mentioning in the beginning, for many different kind of purposes. And so we have been doing an experiment, which is the following, which is putting a tree in a wind tunnel, which is not so easy because you need a large wind tunnel and not too large tree, of course. Actually, you cannot do much outside. Outside, the flow is not really steady enough and controllable enough to have some real good data on the foliage motion easily. So here is the tree. So the tree has a lot of small tree, shady tree. So we measure the global leaves, some more local things. We measure the wind. We measure also the drag and some light aspects. Here is what an experiment looks like when you are inside the wind tunnel. So this is one of the highest wind, like 7 meters per second. So the tree is kind of moving around. I think that my video is a bit shaky. Maybe that's going across the channel. Let's go to the results. That's more important. So we can do plenty of things out of this, but one thing is that you can try to derive a quantity that's going to be a scalar, which is some measure of the motion of the foliage. So we did that by first from the films. So by image correlation, you can of course have the local velocity of the shapes that you have here. And then you can locally do some RMS in time. And then you can average this over the whole shape that you are measuring, and you get some kind of measure of the foliage velocity. Of course, it's a measure. And then can try and see how this evolves with the wind velocity when you move it really by small quantities. What you find out is something which does evolve quite regularly with the wind velocity, up to a point when there is more like a plateau and even a lot of dispersion and different kind of behaviors. So something is happening here. So we need to know where the motions come from. So the idea for this is to look closer into this motion. When you see the foliage here moving, you see both that it's moving because the branch is moving, and also because the leaves by themselves independently are moving. So we did a classical B-orthogonal decomposition of the motion, of the velocity, of the foliage velocity field, okay, where we could get a foliage velocity from the branch modes, that is from the global, more global motions, especially largely correlated motions, which evolve here, and some which are locally correlated, which evolves quite differently. So let's go into this a bit more. If you look at the foliage motion due to the branch dynamics, so which is correlated on a large scale, you can try to compare this with what you would predict from a classical free-structure interaction engineering procedure to estimate the motion from the wind velocity spectrum. So that's what we did. We used a force spectrum out of this, rather classical. We used the vibration transfer function of the beams. We measured of the branches. For instance, we measured everything. Actually, we measured all the geometry of the tree. And from this, we computed by pretty standard procedure the turbulence buffeting response of the system. And we found that this should give a velocity of foliage due to branch going like u to the 11/6, which looks compatible. Of course, we just get the scaling. We don't get the absolute value here because they have some geometrical effects to consider, which are quite complex. But we think that the branch motion by turbulence buffeting does affect the foliage motion in this kind of evolution. Now, if you go to the smaller scales, where the evolution is quite different, we have models of leaf flutters. Leaf flutter is just plate-like structure turning around its petiole. This is torsion flutter. So we have models. And if you apply this to the leaves of the cherry tree, what you find out is that the leaf flutter should appear very soon around just 1 meter per second wind, very soon. And we also have some models for the reconfiguration of the leaves, the one I was talking about before. So when does a leaf really bend outside of its original shape? And we find out that after a couple of meters per second, the leaf should be really outside of its original shape. So this means that there is a short range where the leaf does flutter, and this corresponds to really large amplitude of motions. And then this is prevented probably by friction between leaves that somehow lead to a much more complex behavior. So the scenario we have in mind out of this, for this tree, is that for low velocities, we have a component of the foliage motion which is really dependent on the leaf flutter, which does depend on the shape of the leaves, which is rather high frequency, of course, because leaf flutter is higher frequency. But this disappears for higher velocity, where most of the motion is due to the motion of the branches that hold the leaves. And this is more low frequency, this is more global, more coherent. And this is certainly dependent on the branch geometry and material, or say on the tree architecture. Of course, you may wonder how this scales up if you make from a small tree to a big tree and small leaf to big leaves, of course, which is not a reality. Big trees don't have bigger leaves, of course. What you find out is actually the transition or the crossover between the two actually doesn't depend on the scale, on the length scale. So it seems that what we said for this tree may have some relevance for some other trees. And of course, if you're interested into the applications, if you're interested into things that depend on the velocity of the foliage, for instance, that's the case of visual rendering, or that's also the case of, for instance, on Wi-Fi interception. Of course, then you are going to have to consider the contribution of leaf, flutter, and branch buffeting if you are interested, in, of course, in low winds, which is the most classical case, a couple of meters per second. But if you are interested into things that depend on acceleration of the leaf, typically water retention, but also insect retention on leaves, it's quite important. Then actually it's mostly going to be leaf flutter because the crossover is going to be way off because the acceleration is omega times v. And so to go for a last application of this, so this gives you some idea of what's happening in the foliage motion and how you can quantify it depending on the velocities. And as you can see, it's quite dependent on either the local leaf dynamics, local leaf geometry and interactions, or some kind like the general way the plant as a vibratory system does behave. So there is some application with something called phenotyping, which is something a bit unusual in our world. So just to give you an idea, so when people grow plants in large greenhouses for agronomical purposes, they want to try plants and want to try conditions, for instance. This is done with systems that have hundreds of thousands of plants that move every day and go to a kind of photo booth where essentially they have their picture taken. Yeah, they have the picture taken, and there are a lot of measurements that have been done optically. Of course, this is fully automatic, otherwise you can't do it, of course, just to monitor the growth and all things you can imagine. But then here it's quite difficult to have an idea of what's the mechanical state of the system, because otherwise you have to cut it or to get into it. So we designed a different system, yeah, which is here, okay, which is the range. So we said, so maybe we should excite the system by wind. So we have a plant, we have perfect air. So air does make the plant move with a simple law that you can imagine. And from this, and just by the optical measure, the same that we had for the large tree, you can, of course, almost in real time, get the frequency of oscillation of the plant. And when you use that for to study the evolution, the mechanical evolution of plants, you get some data which you would not get otherwise. For instance, if you want to know the effect of water stress on a plant, on the mechanical state of the plant, you can measure the frequency of the, say, the first vibration mode of the plant that you get by putting it on the machine. And you get an evolution of the frequency with time for a normal plant. It does evolve in time. There are a lot of data points behind this. And then you get the same thing with the water stress population. And what you find out is that the water stress population actually, at some point and for some time, does have a significantly different behavior. So this is a very, very tiny effect, but it's present there, and you can prove it. And you can do that by interacting with the surrounding air. So it's time to come to my conclusion. First of all, I would say that you can imagine that the interactions with these external fluids are quite essential in plants. It does play a lot of things in life, whether for surviving or breaking, whether for interaction with insects, water, mushrooms, anything you name, it's really there. They are very flexible and they are generally multi-scale systems. So from this, it's a bit difficult to just apply standard engineering practices. And you really have some new fluid-structure interactions cases. I would say the case of drag reduction by flexibility, a kind of model problem in the sense that we don't design systems that are so soft, but it does have some interest. I didn't say much about the experimental techniques, but they are really interesting to develop in the sense that whether you're interested into the solid part or the fluid part, it's not the same thing to measure things in a wind tunnel on a NACA profile, and even flexible, and things on a tree outside. For example, the flow inside the trees is a really tough problem. And there is a very vast space for bioinspiration. Why is that? Because plants are very robust and simple systems, and because they are simple, much simpler than animal systems. They certainly have developed across time a very good set of robust strategies to reduce stress, for instance, as I was mentioning in the case of drag reduction. And so, of course, what I was saying at the beginning was too schematical. Of course, there's a lot of interaction on both sides, with the inside and the outside. So it's a more complex problem that there are many examples to put that into that direction. So there have been many people involved in the various things I was mentioning here. And people from Polytechnique, CNRS, the agronomy institution in France. The funding has come from different places, including a joint DGA-DSTL program between France and England, and where there's some work with Nigel Peak at the MTP. So thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to try to answer questions or chat after that on site or in the lab.